Some prisons are built with iron bars, others with wedding vows and winter snow. England, 1812. The snow fell on the morning of Viscount Sutton's funeral, like tears the living were too proud to shed. Lydia stood at the edge of the grave, watching the coffin descend into frozen earth, and felt nothing but a vast hollow relief that it was finally over. Not his life, though that too had been a mercy when the apoplexy took him swiftly in his study, cards still scattered across his desk like accusations. No, what ended that grey January morning was the pretense. The years of smiling at neighbours who whispered behind gloved hands, the careful economies disguised as choices, the slowly tightening noose of debt that her father had woven from gambling markers and promissory notes, pulling it tighter with every hand he lost. There were perhaps a dozen people present, and half of those were servants obligated by employment rather than affection. The vicar spoke words about redemption and mercy, his breath clouding in the bitter air, but Lydia barely heard him. Her attention was fixed on the two figures standing slightly apart from even this small gathering. Her mother, Lady Sutton, had not stopped weeping since her husband collapsed 3 days prior. The sound of it, that constant, exhausting grief, had filled their house until Lydia wanted to scream, just to break the monotony of sorrow. And beside her mother stood Catherine, 16 years old, with their father's dark curls and their mother's delicate frame, shaking not just from cold, but from the terrible understanding that had settled over them all in the past 72 hours. They had nothing, less than nothing. They had debts. Lydia had found the papers 2 nights ago when sleep eluded her, and she had gone to her father's study to feel close to him one last time before they buried him. She had not expected to find evidence of his ruin so carefully documented, as if he had been keeping a ledger of his own destruction. Notes of hand, mortgages, loans taken against a property that had been collateral 3 times over. And there, at the bottom of the stack, a letter on heavy cream paper with a ducal seal pressed into black wax. The Duke of Ashbourne held the note on Whitmore House, had held it, according to the dates, for nearly 2 years. They had been living in a house that no longer belonged to them, on the sufferance of a man Lydia had never met. The service ended. People dispersed quickly, as they always did from funerals in winter, eager to return to warm fires and hot tea and the comfortable distance from death that home provided. Lydia remained, her hand on her mother's trembling arm, Catherine pressed against her other side. The 3 of them stood like that for a long moment, 3 women alone in a world that had very little use for women without men or money. It was Catherine who saw the carriage first. "Lydia," she whispered, her voice tight with something between fear and awe. "Look." The vehicle that rolled up the narrow cemetery path was like something from another world entirely, black as a raven's wing, pulled by 4 matched horses, whose coats gleamed even in the flat winter light. The ducal crest on the door was picked out in silver, a design Lydia recognized from that letter. A falcon in flight, talons extended. The door opened, and a woman emerged. Lady Philippa Graymont was not what Lydia had expected, though she could not have said what she expected from the aunt of a duke. The woman was perhaps 58, with iron-grey hair pulled back in a style that belonged to an earlier era, and eyes the colour of winter sky. She wore black, but it was the black of expensive wool and fine tailoring, mourning clothes that cost more than everything Lydia currently owned. She moved across the snow-dusted ground without hesitation, without the slightest acknowledgement that this was, perhaps, not the most appropriate moment for a social call. "Miss Sutton," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the cold air. Not a question, a statement. "I believe we need to speak about your future." Lydia felt her mother stiffen beside her, felt Catherine's hand grip her sleeve. She kept her own voice steady, though her heart had begun to beat very fast. "Lady Philippa, this is hardly the time." "On the contrary," the older woman replied. "I believe this is precisely the time. Your father's debts are now due, Miss Sutton. The house will be forfeit within the month unless arrangements are made." She paused, and something that might have been sympathy flickered across her austere features. "I am not here to cause you further pain. I am here to offer you a solution. The word hung in the air between them, as tangible as the snow that had begun to fall again. Light flakes that caught in Catherine's dark hair and melted on her mother's wet cheeks. What sort of solution? Lydia asked, though part of her already knew. Part of her had known since she saw that ducal crest approaching. Come to the carriage, Lady Philippa said. We should discuss this in private. The interior of the carriage was warm, heated by stones wrapped in flannel, and so luxurious that Lydia felt shabby just sitting on the velvet seats. Lady Philippa produced a leather portfolio and extracted several documents, spreading them across the space between them with the efficiency of a solicitor. Your father lost considerably more than this property, she began without preamble. There are gambling debts across 3 counties, promissory notes that would beggar your family for a generation. The total sum is... She named a figure that made Lydia's vision swim. My nephew, the Duke of Ashbourne, now holds the majority of these debts. He is a fair man, but he is also a practical one. He will not forgive them out of charity. Then why are you here? Lydia's voice came out steadier than she felt. Lady Philippa folded her hands atop the papers. The Duke requires a wife. His first Duchess died 6 years ago, and while he has an heir, the boy is... She chose her words carefully. Delicate. Another heir is needed, as security for the line. You are of appropriate age, of decent birth despite your father's failings. And most importantly, you are available. In exchange for your marriage to my nephew, all debts will be forgiven. Your mother and sister will receive a pension sufficient for comfortable living. They may remain at Whitmore House for as long as they wish, as the property will be deeded to them in trust. The words fell like stones into still water, each one creating ripples that spread and spread. Marriage, to a duke she had never met, in exchange for her family's survival. What does your nephew say about this arrangement? Lydia asked, her voice hollow. The Duke will do what is necessary for his family, Lady Philippa replied, and there was something in her tone that suggested this was not entirely a willing bridegroom. As will you, I expect. Lydia looked out the carriage window to where her mother and Catherine waited by their father's grave, 2 fragile figures in a white landscape. Catherine was 16. She deserved a season, a chance to find a match that might be based on affection rather than necessity. Their mother deserved peace in her grief, not the workhouse or the charity of distant relations who would make every crust of bread a reminder of their fall from grace. When? Lydia asked. Lady Philippa allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. 3 weeks. Time enough for the banns and the necessary preparations. She produced another paper, this one thick with legal language. You should have a solicitor review this, though I suspect you no longer have one on retainer. Lydia took the document. Her hands did not shake. She had cried all her tears years ago when she first began to understand what her father's gambling meant. There were none left now for her own lost future. I will need to speak with my mother. Of course, but Miss Sutton. Lady Philippa's voice stopped her as she reached for the carriage door. I would make this decision quickly. Other creditors are not as patient as my nephew, and they will not offer such generous terms. That night, Lydia sat with her mother and sister in the drawing room of Whitmore House, watching the firelight play across wallpaper that was beginning to peel at the corners. She explained the offer with as much clarity as she could manage. Her mother wept again, but Catherine, brave Catherine, took Lydia's hand and said, You do not have to do this. Yes, Lydia replied quietly, I do. 3 weeks later, on a day when the cold bit through even the thickest wool, Lydia stood in the chapel of Ashbourne Manor and watched a stranger become her husband. The chapel was beautiful in the way that old things are beautiful, with stained glass that cast coloured light across stone floors and wooden pews worn smooth by generations of the faithful and the obligated. There were perhaps 20 people present, most of them servants of the house, standing witness because it was required rather than desired. Lady Philippa sat in the front row, her face composed. Lydia's mother had been too unwell to travel, and Catherine had stayed to care for her, so Lydia walked down the short aisle alone, carrying no flowers, wearing a dress of ivory silk that Lady Philippa had provided because Lydia's own wardrobe was not suitable for a duchess. Adrian Graymont, 6th Duke of Ashbourne, waited at the altar. He was dressed entirely in black, as if he were attending an execution rather than a wedding. Lydia had seen portraits of him, so his appearance was not a complete shock. But there was a difference between painted canvas and living flesh. He was tall, with black hair and a face that might have been handsome if it were not so carefully devoid of expression. His eyes were green, she noted as she reached the altar, a dark green like pine trees in shadow, and they looked at her with all the warmth of a winter pond. The vicar began the service. The words were familiar, the same words spoken at countless weddings, promising love and honour and all the things that this union would never hold. When the vicar asked if Adrian took Lydia to be his lawfully wedded wife, he answered, "I do," in a voice flat enough to discourage any argument. When it was Lydia's turn, she met his eyes and said the words clearly. If she was to be sold, she would at least maintain her dignity in the transaction. The ring he placed on her finger was heavy gold, warm from his pocket. For just a moment, his fingers touched hers, and she felt the calluses there, unexpected on a gentleman's hand. Then he released her as if she burned. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, Adrian did not kiss her. He simply nodded once, a sharp gesture of acknowledgement, and turned to walk back down the aisle. Lydia followed a step behind, as a duchess should, and tried not to think about how a church that should have represented the beginning of a life together felt instead like a tomb. The wedding breakfast was held in a dining room large enough to echo. Long windows looked out over grounds covered in snow, beautiful and barren. Lydia sat at the high table beside her husband, who did not speak to her. He conversed with Lady Philippa about estate matters, about some problem with tenants in the North Quarter, about anything and everything except the woman he had just married. Servants brought course after course, food richer than anything Lydia had tasted in years, and she ate because it would have been wasteful not to, though it all tasted like ash. When the meal finally ended, Adrian stood. "Mrs. Hutchins will show you to your quarters," he said, addressing Lydia directly for the first time since the ceremony. "I will join you there shortly." The housekeeper, a woman of middle years with kind eyes and a mouth pressed into a firm line of disapproval, led Lydia up 3 flights of stairs. They climbed past the main family rooms, past what were clearly guest chambers, up to a narrower corridor under the eaves. Mrs. Hutchins opened a door at the far end, and Lydia stepped into what was to be her new home. It was not unpleasant. The room was clean, furnished with pieces that had clearly been relegated from finer spaces. A bed with faded curtains, a wardrobe that listed slightly to one side, a single window that looked out over the estate's orchard, bare branches dark against white ground. But it was unmistakably a room of exile, a place where unwanted things were stored. "I am sorry, Your Grace," Mrs. Hutchins said quietly. This was Lady Philippa's choice, not mine. Lydia turned, surprised by the sympathy in the woman's voice. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. When Adrian arrived an hour later, Lydia was sitting in the single chair by the window, still in her wedding dress. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it, studying her with those cold green eyes. "I want to be clear about the nature of this arrangement," he said without preamble. "You are the Duchess of Ashbourne. You will have access to funds for clothing and personal items. The servants will address you with proper respect. You will have the freedom of most of the house and grounds." He paused. "But you will not have a husband." Lydia met his gaze. "Then why marry me at all? I need an heir. A spare heir." His voice was flat, reciting facts. "My son is 6 years old and has been ill since birth. His constitution is weak. If something were to happen to him, the dukedom would pass to my cousin, a man I would not trust with a stray dog, let alone a legacy. You will provide another son. When that obligation is fulfilled, we need have nothing more to do with one another." The coldness of it stole her breath. "I see. Do you?" He pushed away from the door, taking a single step closer. "I loved my first wife. She died bringing my son into this world, and I will not pretend to feel for you what I felt for her. This is a transaction, Miss Sutton. I am Lady Ashbourne now," Lydia said quietly. "You saw to that." Something flickered in his eyes. Anger, perhaps, or simply irritation at being corrected. Yes, he agreed. You are. Try to remember the distinction between the title and the woman who holds it. One is permanent, the other is not. He left without another word, the door closing behind him with a soft click that sounded impossibly loud in the sudden silence. Lydia sat in that chair until the winter sun set and the room grew dark around her. She did not cry. She had made her choice with open eyes, had traded her future for her family's security. But as the cold deepened and the old house settled into night around her, she allowed herself to wonder, just for a moment, what it might have been like to marry a man who at least tried to pretend he wanted her there. In the morning, she would begin learning the rules of her new prison. She would smile at servants who did not meet her eyes. She would navigate the hostility of Lady Philippa with as much grace as she could manage. She would write to her mother and Catherine and tell them only that she was well, because the truth would break their hearts. But tonight, on her wedding night, in a room that smelled of lavender and dust, Lydia allowed herself the luxury of grief for the girl she had been, who had once believed in love. The first weeks of February passed in a silence so complete that Lydia sometimes wondered if she had lost the ability to hear properly. She took her meals alone in the small dining room on the second floor, a space that she suspected had once been used for overflow guests, but now served as her private exile. Servants brought food on silver trays, set it before her without meeting her eyes, and departed as quickly as propriety allowed. The meals themselves were generous, far more elaborate than anything she had known at Whitmore House in recent years, but Lydia found she had little appetite for pheasant and wine sauces when eating them felt like attending a banquet for one. Adrian, for his part, kept to his word about having nothing to do with her. She saw him occasionally in the corridors, always at a distance, always moving away from her rather than toward. Once, she had entered the library to find him there, and he had simply closed his book and left without a word, as if her presence contaminated the very air he breathed. It should not have hurt, given that she had expected nothing else. But Lydia discovered that expectation and experience were very different things. If Adrian's neglect was cold, Lady Philippa's attention was colder still. The Duke's aunt had taken it upon herself to oversee Lydia's education in what she called the proper management of a ducal household, though her lessons consisted primarily of pointing out everything Lydia did incorrectly. The late Duchess always took her tea in the morning room, Lady Philippa would say, her voice carrying across whatever space they occupied. She found the light there most agreeable. But I suppose you prefer the shadows of the second floor. Or when Lydia wore a dress of pale blue that she thought rather pretty. Marguerite always wore jewel tones. She understood that a duchess must make a statement. But perhaps you are accustomed to more modest presentations. The comparisons were endless, each one designed to remind Lydia that she was a poor replacement for a woman she had never met and could never equal. Marguerite had been accomplished at the pianoforte. Marguerite had spoken French like a native. Marguerite had known exactly how to manage the servants, the accounts, the social obligations that came with a title. Marguerite had been, in short, everything that Lydia was not. After the first week, Lydia stopped trying to defend herself and simply nodded when Lady Philippa spoke, letting the criticisms wash over her like cold rain. It was easier than arguing, and arguing would have required the older woman to see her as a person rather than an inconvenience. With so little to occupy her time and no one to occupy it with, Lydia began to explore Ashbourne Manor. It was a vast house, built over centuries, with wings that sprawled in seemingly random directions. Some rooms were maintained beautifully, with fresh flowers and polished furniture. Others were clearly closed up, furniture covered in cloth, the air thick with disuse. She wandered through portrait galleries where generations of Graymonts stared down at her with expressions ranging from stern disapproval to mild curiosity. She found a conservatory where winter light filtered through glass panes onto plants that had long since died from neglect. She discovered a music room with a pianoforte that was badly out of tune, its keys yellowed with age. But there was one part of the house that remained stubbornly closed to her. The north wing on the third floor was always locked, and none of the servants would speak of it when she asked. They would find suddenly urgent tasks elsewhere, or simply shake their heads and hurry away. Even Mrs. Hutchins, who had shown her that small kindness on her wedding day, grew tight-lipped when Lydia inquired about what lay beyond those locked doors. It was curiosity more than anything else that kept Lydia thinking about the north wing. In a house where she was otherwise free to wander like a ghost, that single locked door felt like a rebuke. What could possibly be so important, so secret, that it required such careful guarding? She got her answer on a night when sleep refused to come, and the silence of her attic room felt suffocating. Lydia had taken to walking the corridors when insomnia plagued her, finding some comfort in movement even if she had nowhere particular to go. She was on the main staircase, considering whether to raid the library for something to read, when she heard it. A cough, wet and painful, the kind that spoke of congested lungs and laboured breathing. And it was coming from above, from the direction of that forbidden north wing. Lydia climbed the stairs without thinking, following the sound through the dark corridors lit only by the candle she carried. The coughing continued, punctuated by small, distressed sounds that made her heart clench. At the end of the north corridor, beneath the door she had found locked so many times before, a sliver of light showed. She knelt down, feeling slightly ridiculous, and peered through the keyhole. The room beyond was larger than her own, but it had the same air of neglect that characterized the closed-up spaces of the house. Toys lay scattered across the floor. Toy soldiers and a wooden horse and a stuffed bear with one button eye hanging by a thread, but they were covered in a fine layer of dust as if no one had played with them in a very long time. A bed with heavy curtains dominated one wall, and in it, dwarfed by pillows and blankets, was a child. He could not have been more than 6 or 7, though it was hard to tell because he was so small, so pale. His hair was light brown, and even from her limited vantage point, Lydia could see the shadows beneath his eyes, the hollow quality of his cheeks. He was coughing again, and beside the bed, Mrs. Hutchins slept in a chair, her head tilted back, clearly exhausted from keeping watch. The child was alone with his suffering, and something about that image broke through all the careful walls Lydia had built around her heart. She stood, her knees protesting the cold floor, and hurried back down to the second floor where the servants had their rooms. She found Clara, the young maid who had smiled at her once in passing, and knocked softly on her door. Clara answered in her nightgown, her eyes wide with surprise and a little fear. "Your Grace? Is something wrong?" "The north wing," Lydia said quietly. "There is a child there. Who is he?" The fear in Clara's face intensified. "Your Grace, I cannot." "Lady Philippa said we were not to speak of it." "Lady Philippa is not here," Lydia said, more sharply than she intended. "A child is ill, Clara. Please." The maid wavered, loyalty and compassion warring on her young face. Finally, compassion won. "Come inside, Your Grace. We must not be overheard." In Clara's small room, lit by a single candle, the maid told Lydia what everyone in the household apparently knew, but would not speak of. The child was Thomas, the Duke's son and heir. He had been born prematurely 6 years ago, and the birth had killed his mother. The Duchess, Marguerite, had laboured for 2 days before the child finally came, too small and too weak, while Adrian had been away in London on business. By the time he returned, his wife was dead, and his son was barely clinging to life. "Thomas survived," Clara whispered, "but he has never been strong. His lungs, the doctors say. He catches every illness that passes through the household. 3 years ago, he contracted pneumonia and nearly died." The Duke was beside himself with fear. When Thomas recovered, His Grace gave orders that the boy was to be confined to the north wing, away from draughts and visitors and anything that might carry disease. Only Mrs. Hutchins and Dr. Pembley are allowed near him. Even the Duke himself rarely visits. "That is monstrous," Lydia breathed. "He is a child, not a prisoner." "The Duke believes he is protecting him," Clara said, though her tone suggested she did not entirely agree. "After losing the Duchess, I think he cannot bear the thought of losing his son as well. But—" She trailed off, biting her lip. "But," Lydia prompted, "it is killing the boy anyway, Your Grace, just more slowly." After Clara fell back asleep, Lydia returned to her own room, but she did not sleep. She lay in her narrow bed and listened to the house settle around her, and thought about a child locked away in the name of safety. slowly withering like a plant kept from the sun. The next night, she returned to Clara's room. "I need you to get me a key to the north wing." Clara's eyes went wide. "Your Grace, I could not. If Lady Philippa discovered it, if the Duke found out—" "They will not," Lydia said, with more confidence than she felt. "Please, Clara, I am only asking to visit him, to see if there is anything I might do to help." It took 3 more nights of persuasion before Clara finally agreed, and another 2 days before she managed to have a duplicate key made by a blacksmith in the village, telling him it was for a wardrobe that needed repair. When she pressed the cold metal into Lydia's hand, her expression was torn between fear and hope. "He never smiles, Your Grace," Clara whispered. "Master Thomas, he never laughs. I have worked here 2 years, and I have never seen him happy." That night, long after the household had retired and the corridors lay quiet under darkness, Lydia took her candle and the key and climbed to the north wing. The lock turned smoothly, well-oiled despite its disuse. Lydia pushed the door open slowly, mindful of the sleeping Mrs. Hutchins, and stepped into Thomas Graymont's prison. The smell hit her first, the stale air of a room where windows were never opened, thick with the scent of medicines and the faint underlying sweetness of sickness. The toys she had glimpsed through the keyhole looked even sadder up close, abandoned playthings of a childhood interrupted. And in the bed, the boy was awake, his green eyes, so like his father's, watching her approach with a mixture of fear and something else. Wonder, perhaps, or simply the desperate hope of anyone who has been alone too long. "Do not be afraid," Lydia said softly, setting her candle on the table beside the bed. "I am not here to hurt you." "Are you a ghost?" Thomas asked, his voice hoarse from coughing. "Mrs. Hutchins says my mamma is watching over me from heaven. Are you her?" The question pierced Lydia's heart. "No, sweetheart, I am not a ghost. My name is Lydia. I am your father's new wife." Thomas considered this, his small face serious. "I did not know Papa had married again. No one told me. I suspect no one tells you very much," Lydia said gently, moving closer to sit on the edge of the bed. "How long have you been in this room, Thomas?" "Forever," he said simply. "Well, Mrs. Hutchins says it has been 3 years, but that feels like forever. I got very sick once, and Papa said I had to stay here where it was safe. He promised it would not be for long, but—" The boy's eyes filled with tears that he blinked away quickly, as if crying were not allowed. "He never comes anymore, only sometimes, and he does not stay." Lydia felt anger kindle in her chest, hot and righteous. Whatever Adrian's reasons, however pure his intentions, this was cruelty. "What about Dr. Pemberley? Does he visit?" "Once a week. He listens to my chest and tells Mrs. Hutchins what medicines to give me, but he does not talk to me much. He is very busy, he says." "Ah, and you spend all day here? Every day?" Thomas nodded. "Mrs. Hutchins is very kind. She reads to me sometimes, when she's not too tired. But mostly I just sit and look out the window. I can see the orchard from here. In the spring, there are flowers, but I have only seen them from far away." "When was the last time you went outside?" Lydia asked, though she already knew the answer. "I cannot remember," Thomas said, and the simple honesty of it broke something in Lydia that she had not realized still needed breaking. She stayed with him for an hour that first night, talking quietly so as not to wake Mrs. Hutchins. She told him about Whitmore House, about the horses her father had kept before he sold them, about her sister Catherine, who loved to draw. Thomas listened with the hungry attention of someone starved for human contact, and when she finally rose to leave, he caught her hand. "Will you come back?" he asked, and the desperation in his voice was unmistakable. Lydia squeezed his small, cold fingers. "I will come back every night that I can," she promised. "You are not alone anymore, Thomas." As she slipped from the room and locked the door behind her, Lydia felt the first stirring of purpose she had experienced since coming to Ashbourne Manor. She had been brought here as a broodmare, a solution to a dynastic problem. But perhaps she could be something else as well. Perhaps she could be what that lonely child needed, even if his father would never allow her to be what she might have been to him. She climbed back to her attic room and lay down fully clothed on top of the covers, staring at the ceiling and making plans. The visits became a ritual, sacred in their secrecy and sustaining in their warmth. Every night, when the house fell into the deep silence that comes after midnight, Lydia would slip from her attic room and climb the stairs to the north wing. The key Clara had obtained felt like a talisman in her pocket, a small rebellion against the rules that governed Ashbourne Manor with invisible but unbreakable chains. March arrived with tentative hints of spring, though the mornings still bit with cold and frost-painted patterns on the windows each night. Thomas waited for her, Lydia discovered, staying awake long past the hour when Mrs. Hutchins fell into exhausted sleep in her chair. On the third visit, she found him sitting up in bed, a book open on his lap that he clearly could not read, pretending to study it as if that might make her appear faster. "You came," he said, when she opened the door, and the relief in his voice made her chest ache. "I promised, did I not?" Lydia set down the bundle she had brought, wrapped in a kitchen cloth to muffle any sounds. "I brought you something." Inside were treasures stolen from various corners of the house. A book of fairy tales from the library, its pages illustrated with beautiful engravings of castles and forests and brave knights. A packet of butter biscuits from the kitchen, secured during a moment when the cook had stepped out to the cold room. 3 sticks of charcoal and several sheets of drawing paper she had found in a desk drawer. Thomas touched each item with reverent fingers, as if they were made of glass and might shatter. "For me? Truly, truly. I thought you might enjoy having things to do during the day, when I cannot be here. Will you read to me?" Thomas held up the book of fairy tales. Mrs. Hutchins reads, but her eyes hurt when the light is poor, and she falls asleep. So Lydia read, keeping her voice low, spinning tales of princes who rescued princesses from towers, and youngest sons who won kingdoms through cleverness and kindness. Thomas listened with an intensity that suggested he was memorizing every word, his green eyes never leaving her face. When she finished the third story, he asked the first of what would become an endless stream of questions. "Are there really dragons?" "I have never seen one," Lydia admitted. "But the world is very large. Perhaps there are dragons somewhere we have not looked. Have you been many places?" "Not so many. I grew up in a house much smaller than this, with my mother and sister. We did not travel far." "You have a sister?" Thomas sat up straighter, fascinated. "What is her name? How old is she? Does she like dragons?" The questions tumbled out one after another, and Lydia answered them all with patience, understanding that this was not idle curiosity, but desperate hunger. Thomas had been starved of conversation, of connection, of all the normal interactions that children needed as much as food and water. Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged. Lydia would arrive near midnight, and they would spend an hour, or sometimes 2, in quiet companionship. She brought him things she thought might brighten his world. An orange from the kitchen, which he had never tasted, and declared the most wonderful thing he had ever eaten. A small pot of ink and a proper pen, so he could practice the letters she was teaching him. A handkerchief embroidered with a horse, which he clutched like a lifeline. But she also began to notice things that troubled her. Thomas's diet consisted almost entirely of thin porridge, weak broth, and plain bread soaked in milk. When she asked Mrs. Hutchins about it one night, the older woman, who had begun to wake during Lydia's visits and had shown no inclination to report her, sighed deeply. "Dr. Pembley's orders, Your Grace. He says rich foods will inflame the boy's constitution, make his lungs worse. So we keep everything very plain." Lydia had learned some basic medicine from her grandmother, a practical woman who believed that most ailments could be treated with common sense and herbs from the garden. Starving a growing child of proper nutrition seemed the opposite of common sense. "What about eggs, fresh fruit, meat?" "Not permitted, Your Grace." The air in the room bothered her too. It was stale and heavy, smelling of sickness and the chamber pot and unwashed linen. "Why are the windows never opened?" "Doctor, Pembley says fresh air carries miasmas that could sicken Master Thomas. The room must be kept warm and sealed." It was all Lydia could do not to argue, but she understood that Mrs. Hutchins was simply following orders, doing her best in an impossible situation. Instead, She began making small changes, so subtle that they might be overlooked. She opened the window just a crack during her visits, letting in a thin stream of cool, clean air. She brought Thomas an egg, boiled and still warm, and watched him eat it with surprised delight. She smuggled in an apple, small and slightly wrinkled from winter storage but still sweet. "We must keep this between us," she told Thomas seriously. "If anyone asks, you did not get these things from me." Thomas, who at 6 years old had already learned to keep secrets from his own father, nodded solemnly. "I promise." Clara became essential to these efforts. The young maid, emboldened by Lydia's kindness and genuinely worried about Thomas, began actively helping. She would slip Lydia extra food from the kitchen, claiming it was for the new Duchess's personal consumption. She provided clean linens when the ones in Thomas's room grew too musty. She even, on one memorable occasion, procured a small wooden top that had belonged to her brother, which Thomas spent hours learning to spin. During the days when Lydia moved through the house like a ghost in silk slippers, she began to push back in other small ways against the confines of her position. She wore dresses in colours that pleased her, pale green and soft yellow, instead of the dark shades Lady Philippa suggested. When the older woman commented that the Duchess should always take tea in the morning room, Lydia deliberately took hers in the library instead. They were petty rebellions, perhaps, but they were all she had. Lady Philippa noticed. Of course she noticed. The woman seemed to have an uncanny ability to sense any deviation from her precise vision of how Ashbourne Manor should be run. "You seem to have a great deal of time on your hands, my dear," she said one afternoon, finding Lydia in the conservatory examining the dead plants. "Perhaps you should occupy yourself with more appropriate pursuits. Marguerite used to spend her afternoons doing needlework for the church. I still have her patterns, if you would like to see them." "I prefer reading," Lydia said mildly, not looking up from the withered fern she was considering. "But thank you." Reading. Lady Philippa made it sound like a vice. "Well, I suppose one must find entertainment where one can, though Marguerite always said that a duchess's duty was to the household, not to her own amusement." "Then it is fortunate that I am not Marguerite," Lydia replied, and immediately regretted the sharpness in her tone. Lady Philippa's eyes narrowed. "No," she agreed coldly, "you certainly are not." The tension came to a head at dinner one evening in late March. Adrian had been away for several days on business in London, and his return meant that dinner would be a formal affair rather than Lydia's usual solitary meal. She dressed carefully in a gown of deep blue, one of the few pretty things she owned, and came down to find both Adrian and his aunt already seated. The meal proceeded in near silence until the fourth course, when Lady Philippa set down her fork with a precise click of silver on china. "Adrian, we must discuss the household accounts. I have noticed several irregularities." "What sort of irregularities?" Adrian asked, his tone suggesting he was not particularly interested. "Increased expenditures in the kitchen, missing items from the linen closet, and there have been reports from the servants about—" She paused delicately. "Unusual activities." Lydia's heart began to beat faster, but she kept her expression calm. "What sort of unusual activities?" Adrian's attention was now fully focused on his aunt. "I would not wish to make accusations without proof," Lady Philippa said, in a tone that suggested she had plenty of proof and was simply waiting for the right moment to present it. "But I believe certain household rules are not being properly observed. If you have concerns about household management, Philippa, you should address them directly with me," Lydia said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I am the Duchess, after all. Such matters fall under my authority." Lady Philippa's smile was cold. "But my dear, you have shown so little interest in household management until now. I was simply trying to spare you the burden. I am quite capable of managing my own burdens." "Are you?" The older woman's voice took on an edge. "Because it seems to me that you are more interested in disrupting the smooth running of this house than in maintaining it. Marguerite understood that a duchess's role requires discretion and respect for established protocols." "Marguerite is dead," Lydia said, and regretted it instantly. The silence that followed was terrible. Adrian's face had gone white, then red. He set down his wineglass with a controlled movement that somehow conveyed more anger than if he had thrown it. "You will retire to your room," he said to Lydia, his voice very quiet and very cold. "Adrian, I did not mean—" "Now!" Lydia rose from her chair, her napkin falling forgotten to the floor. She walked from the dining room with her head high, but her hands were shaking. She had overstepped, badly, and she knew it. Whatever small progress she might have made, whatever tiny measure of respect she might have earned, had just been undone by her own sharp tongue. She was in her room, still in her dinner dress, when Adrian knocked and entered without waiting for permission. His face was hard, all the softness she had sometimes imagined she saw in him completely erased. "You will not speak of my late wife in that manner again," he said. "Do you understand? I apologize." It was thoughtless and cruel. It was. He moved further into the room, his presence filling the small space. "You have been here less than 2 months, and already you seem determined to upset the order of this household. My aunt has served this family faithfully for years. She deserves your respect." Lydia felt her own anger rising to meet his. "And what do I deserve, Your Grace? I am your Duchess, whether you wish to acknowledge me as such or not. I am not a servant to be ordered about by your aunt. I am not a child to be corrected at the dinner table. Even if you refuse to see me as your wife, I am still the Duchess of Ashbourne." Something flickered in Adrian's eyes, surprise perhaps that she would dare to challenge him. "You are here to fulfill a specific purpose," he said. "Nothing more." "Yes," Lydia agreed bitterly. "You have made that abundantly clear." They stood staring at each other, and for just a moment Lydia thought she saw something other than anger in his face. Confusion, maybe, or the faintest hint of uncertainty. But then he turned and left without another word, and she was alone again. She did not go to visit Thomas that night, afraid that her agitated state might wake Mrs. Hutchins, or that someone might be watching for exactly such a transgression. Instead, she lay awake in her bed, listening to the house settle around her, and feeling the weight of her isolation pressing down like a physical thing. At 3:30 in the morning, she heard the commotion. Footsteps, running, voices, urgent and frightened. The sound of doors opening and slamming. Lydia threw on her dressing gown and hurried into the corridor. Other servants were emerging from their rooms, looking confused and worried. "What has happened?" Lydia asked Clara, who was tying her apron with fumbling fingers. "It is Master Thomas, Your Grace," the maid said, her face pale. "Mrs. Hutchins sent for Dr. Pembley. The boy has a fever, a terrible fever. She fears the worst." Lydia did not think. She simply ran, up the stairs to the north wing, not caring who saw her or what questions it might raise. The door to Thomas's room stood open, light spilling into the dark corridor. Inside, Mrs. Hutchins was bent over the bed, her face creased with worry. And at the bedside, black bag already open, stood Dr. Pembley, preparing to bleed a child who looked more dead than alive. "Stop," Lydia said, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. "You will not touch him." Dr. Pembley turned, his expression shifting from concentration to outrage. "Your Grace, this is not—" "I said stop." Lydia moved to the bedside, placing herself between the doctor and Thomas. The boy's skin was burning to the touch, his breathing shallow and laboured. His eyes were closed, and he did not respond when she said his name. "Bloodletting is the only treatment for such a fever," Dr. Pembley said, drawing himself up with affronted dignity. "I must insist." "You will insist on nothing." Lydia's mind was racing, thinking of all the things her grandmother had taught her, all the practical knowledge that had been dismissed as old wives' tales by men like this. The child is already weak. Taking his blood will only weaken him further. "And what would you suggest?" The doctor's tone dripped with condescension. "Herbs and superstition? If necessary, yes." "Your Grace," Mrs. Hutchins said quietly, desperately, "please, I do not know what to do. He is so very ill." Lydia looked down at Thomas, at this small boy who had asked her about dragons and eaten an orange for the first time and learned to spin a top. This child who was being killed by the very measures meant to protect him. "Send for the Duke," she said, "now, and then bring me cool water, clean cloths, and any willow bark you have in the still room." "The Duke will never allow this," Dr. Pembley protested. Lydia met his eyes steadily. "Then he can tell me so himself." Adrian arrived within minutes, still in his shirt sleeves, his hair dishevelled as if he had been dragged from sleep. He took in the scene with a single sweeping glance. His son, flushed with fever and barely conscious. Dr. Pembley, standing rigidly beside the bed, his face mottled with anger. Mrs. Hutchins wringing her hands near the window, and Lydia, positioned between the doctor and Thomas like a shield made of silk and stubborn will. What is the meaning of this? Adrian's voice was dangerous in its quietness. Dr. Pembley spoke first, his words tumbling out in offended haste. "Your Grace, I was attempting to treat the boy when your wife interfered. She has prevented me from performing a necessary bloodletting and has instead demanded I leave the child's care to superstition and folk remedies. I must protest in the strongest possible terms." Adrian turned to Lydia. "Explain yourself." She met his eyes without flinching, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "Your son is burning with fever. He is already weak from poor diet and lack of fresh air. Bleeding him now could kill him faster than the fever itself. I am asking for 24 hours to try another way." "Another way," Adrian repeated flatly. "You are a physician now." "No, but my grandmother was a healer in our village. She taught me things that doctors often dismiss, but that work nonetheless. Willow bark tea to reduce fever, cool compresses to bring down the heat, mustard plaster for his chest. Simple treatments, Your Grace, but effective ones." "This is absurd," Dr. Pembley interjected. "My Lord Duke, I have been practicing medicine for 30 years. This woman has no training, no understanding of the humours or the proper balance of the body's fluids. If you allow her to proceed, the boy's death will be on your hands." Adrian looked down at his son. Thomas's breathing was rapid and shallow, each exhale accompanied by a small, pained sound. His skin had taken on a greyish cast beneath the fever flush, and even from where he stood, Adrian could feel the heat radiating from the small body. "How long has he been like this?" Adrian asked Mrs. Hutchins, his voice strained. "The fever came on sudden this evening, Your Grace. It has been climbing for hours. I did everything Dr. Pembley told me during his last visit, all the usual remedies, but nothing has helped." Adrian's jaw clenched. Lydia could see the war happening behind his eyes. Fear and anger and desperation all fighting for control. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if each one cost him something. 24 hours, he said to Lydia. "But if he worsens, Dr. Pembley will proceed as he sees fit." "Your Grace, I must protest," the doctor began. "You have made your protest. It is noted." Adrian turned to the man with cold finality. "You may wait in the sitting room down the hall. If we require your services, we will send for you." Dr. Pembley gathered his bag with stiff, offended movements and stalked from the room. The moment he was gone, Lydia felt as if she could breathe properly for the first time since entering. "Mrs. Hutchins," she said, her mind already racing through everything she would need. "Please bring cool water, as much as you can carry. Clean cloths, willow bark from the still room, if there is any, and if not, white willow grows near the stream. Fresh growth is best. Also, mustard powder, flour, and egg whites." The older woman nodded and hurried out. Lydia turned to find Adrian still standing frozen at the foot of the bed, staring at his son with an expression that might have been carved from stone, except for the terrible anguish in his eyes. "You should sit," Lydia said gently. "This will be a long night. I will stand. You will be useless if you exhaust yourself. Please, Your Grace. Sit." Adrian moved as if in a dream, sinking into the chair Mrs. Hutchins had vacated. From there, he watched in silence as Lydia began her work. Clara arrived first, arms laden with a basin of water and an armful of linens. Behind her came Mrs. Hutchins with the willow bark and other supplies. Lydia worked quickly, her hands steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. She had treated fevers before, in cottages and farmhouses where her grandmother had been called, but never one so severe, never in a child so fragile, never with so much riding on the outcome. She stripped Thomas down to his nightshirt making Adrian turn away when his son's thin, pale body was revealed, each rib countable, each joint too prominent. Then she began sponging him with cool water, working methodically from his forehead, down his arms, across his chest, down his legs. The water in the basin grew warm almost immediately, and Clara rushed to replace it with fresh. "Keep it coming," Lydia murmured. "We need to draw the heat out." While Clara managed the water, Lydia prepared the willow bark tea, crushing the bark and steeping it in hot water until the liquid turned bitter and dark. She cooled it with more water and then, with Mrs. Hutchins's help, managed to get small sips past Thomas's cracked lips. Most of it ran down his chin, but some went down his throat, enough to perhaps make a difference. The mustard plaster came next, a paste of mustard powder, flour, and egg whites spread on a cloth and laid across Thomas's chest. Her grandmother had sworn by these for congestion, though she had warned they could burn if left too long. Lydia watched carefully, checking every few minutes, removing it when his skin began to redden. Through it all, Adrian sat motionless in his chair, his eyes never leaving his son's face. The clock on the mantel chimed midnight, then 1, then 2. The fever did not break. If anything, Thomas seemed to worsen, his breathing growing more laboured, his small body twitching and jerking as the fever dreams took him. At 2:30, Thomas began to call out. "Mamma," he whispered, the word barely audible. "Mamma, where are you?" Adrian made a sound deep in his throat, something between a groan and a sob. His hands gripped the arms of his chair until his knuckles went white. "Mamma, I am cold. So cold." "He is burning up," Clara whispered to Lydia. "How can he be cold?" "The fever confuses the body," Lydia explained, though her own worry was mounting. She had never seen a fever this high that did not break within a few hours of treatment. Thomas's skin was so hot now that touching him felt like touching a kettle left too long on the fire. "Mama, please come back." The words broke something in Adrian. He surged from his chair and dropped to his knees beside the bed, taking his son's small hand in both of his much larger ones. "I am here, Thomas. Papa is here." But Thomas's eyes, when they flickered open, were glazed and unseeing. "Where is Mama? She said she would come back. She cannot come back, son. She is gone. Because of me." Thomas's voice was so small, so lost. "Mrs. Hutchins said Mama died when I was born. Did I kill her?" "No." Adrian's voice broke on the word. "No, Thomas. You did not kill her." "I did." Lydia froze in the act of wringing out another cloth. Across the room, even Clara stopped moving. "It was my fault," Adrian continued, the words pouring out as if a dam had broken. "I was not here when you were born. I was in London on business that could have waited, that should have waited. Your mother went into labour 2 weeks early, and I was not here. By the time I received word and returned, she had been labouring for nearly 2 days. She was exhausted. The midwife said, if I had been here, if she had not been so frightened, perhaps it would have gone differently. Perhaps she would have lived." His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I have spent 6 years trying to keep you safe because I could not keep her safe. I thought, if I could just protect you from everything, from illness and injury and the whole dangerous world, then perhaps I could make up for failing her. But I was wrong, was I not? I did not protect you. I simply locked you away. I made you a prisoner in your own home." Thomas had grown still, his breathing slightly less laboured, as if even in his fever haze he could sense the importance of this moment. "When your mother died," Adrian said, "I wanted to die too. But I had you, and you needed me. Except I did not know how to be your father without her. She was going to teach me. We had talked about it, planned it. And then she was gone, and you were this tiny, fragile thing that I was terrified of breaking. So I let my mother and then my aunt take over your care. I let the doctors dictate your life. I stayed away because every time I looked at you, I saw her, and the guilt was unbearable." Lydia felt tears sliding down her own cheeks. Beside her, Mrs. Hutchins was openly weeping. "I am sorry, Thomas. I am so desperately sorry. You deserved better. You deserved a father who was brave enough to love you without fear. And if you recover from this, I swear to you, I will try to be that father. I will tear down every wall I built. I will let you live instead of merely exist. Just please, please hold on. Please do not leave me too." For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the crackle of the fire and Thomas's laboured breathing. Then Lydia moved forward, touching Adrian's shoulder gently. "He needs you to be strong now," she said softly. "Talk to him. Tell him about the things you will do together when he is well. Give him something to hold on to." Adrian looked up at her, his face ravaged by tears and grief and hope so fragile it might shatter at a breath. Then he turned back to his son. "When you are well," he began, his voice steadier, "we will go outside together. We will walk in the orchard. Would you like that? We will find every tree that has a good climbing branch, and I will lift you up so you can see the world from up high. And in the summer, we will go down to the stream and catch fish. I will teach you to ride. We will get you a pony. Something gentle, but with spirit. What would you name a pony, Thomas?" The night wore on. Lydia continued her treatments, never pausing, never resting. Adrian continued talking, painting pictures of a future that seemed to grow more possible with every word. Clara and Mrs. Hutchins assisted wherever they could, bringing fresh water, stoking the fire, preparing more tea. At 4 o'clock, when the darkest part of night pressed against the windows, Thomas's breathing began to change. It was subtle at first, so subtle that Lydia thought she might be imagining it. But no, it was definitely slowing, deepening, becoming less laboured. She pressed her hand to his forehead and felt her heart leap. "The fever," she whispered. "I think it is breaking." Adrian was on his feet instantly. "Are you certain? Feel for yourself." Adrian touched his son's face with trembling fingers. "He is cooler. He is definitely cooler." As if in response to his father's voice, Thomas's eyes fluttered open. They were still glazed, still unfocused, but there was awareness there, a presence that had been absent for hours. "Papa," his voice was barely a croak. "I am here, son. I am right here. I am thirsty." Such a simple statement, such a normal, ordinary request. And yet it filled the room with more relief than the grandest pronouncement. Lydia quickly poured water from the pitcher, and together she and Adrian helped Thomas sit up enough to drink. He managed several small sips before exhaustion claimed him again. But this time, when he fell back against the pillows, his breathing was even, natural, the breathing of sleep rather than fever. By the time dawn broke over Ashbourne Manor, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Thomas's fever had broken completely. His skin was still warm, but no longer burning, and when Mrs. Hutchins checked his pulse, she pronounced it strong and steady. Dr. Pembley, summoned by a servant, arrived to find his patient sleeping peacefully. He examined Thomas with pursed lips and reluctant movements, checked his breathing, felt his forehead, and finally straightened. "The crisis appears to have passed," he said stiffly, "though I maintain that traditional methods would have achieved the same result." "Would they?" Adrian's voice was soft but carried an edge that made the doctor flinch. "Thank you for your concern, Dr. Pembley. You may go." When they were alone again, just Adrian and Lydia in the quiet room, while Mrs. Hutchins dozed in the corner and Thomas slept, Adrian turned to his wife. His face was haggard, his eyes red-rimmed from tears and sleeplessness. But there was something new in his expression, something that might, perhaps, be the beginning of respect. "Thank you," he said simply. "You saved his life." "We do not know that for certain," Lydia demurred, though her own relief made her legs weak. "I know it. You stood between my son and death and you refused to yield." He paused, seeming to struggle with words. "I have been unfair to you, cruel even. You came to this house expecting nothing and asking for little, and I treated you as if your very presence was an insult to my late wife's memory. But tonight you showed me that you are not a replacement for Marguerite. You are your own person, with your own strength and your own worth. And Thomas is alive because of you." Lydia felt fresh tears prick at her eyes. "I did only what anyone with a heart would do." "No," Adrian said quietly. You did what I should have done years ago. You saw a child who needed help, and you helped him. Despite my rules, despite the risks, despite knowing I might punish you for it. That takes courage I am not certain I possess." He reached out, hesitated, then gently took her hand. It was the first time since their wedding day that he had touched her with anything approaching tenderness. "Will you help me?" he asked. "Help me learn how to be the father he needs. Help me undo the damage I have done." Lydia looked down at their joined hands, his large and warm around her smaller, work-roughened fingers. Then she looked at Thomas, sleeping peacefully in the morning light, and finally back at Adrian. "Yes," she said, "I will help you." And for the first time since coming to Ashbourne Manor, Lydia felt a spark of something that might, eventually, grow into hope. April arrived at Ashbourne Manor like a tentative promise, bringing with it longer days and the first hints of warmth after a winter that had seemed determined to last forever. The changes in the weather were matched by changes within the house itself, subtle at first, but gradually building into something that might, with time and care, become transformative. Thomas recovered slowly over the weeks following his crisis. The fever had left him weak and thin, but there was a lightness about him now that had nothing to do with his physical state. For the first time in 3 years, his father visited him daily. Not brief, awkward visits where Adrian stood by the door making stilted conversation before fleeing, but real visits where he would sit by Thomas's bedside and talk, and more importantly, listen. Lydia found herself present for many of these visits, having been granted official permission to access the North Wing whenever she wished. The pretense of secrecy was gone, and with it went some of the tension that had characterized her early weeks at Ashbourne Manor. She was no longer a ghost haunting the corridors at midnight, but a recognized presence, acknowledged, if not yet fully accepted. "Tell me about the horses again, Papa," Thomas would say, his green eyes bright with an eagerness that broke and mended Lydia's heart in equal measure. "The ones you rode when you were my age," and Adrian would tell him, his voice gradually losing its stiffness as he spoke of the stable full of ponies his father had kept, of learning to jump over low fences, of falling off more times than he could count, but always getting back on. As he talked, he would glance at Lydia, and she would see in his face a growing awareness of all the experiences his son had been denied, and all the experiences that might yet be salvaged. The first time Thomas called her Tia Lydia, she had been reading to him from a book of natural history, describing exotic birds neither of them had ever seen. He had interrupted her mid-sentence about the plumage of a peacock. "Tia Lydia, what does iridescent mean?" She had looked up from the page, her breath catching. "It means something that shimmers with many colours, like oil on water or a soap bubble in sunlight. I should like to see something iridescent someday," Thomas had said thoughtfully, and then, without any apparent awareness of the significance of his words, had asked her to continue reading. Adrian, sitting in his usual chair by the window, had gone very still. When Lydia glanced at him, she saw something complicated moving across his face. Not anger, as she might have feared, but a kind of wondering sadness. After Thomas fell asleep that afternoon, Adrian walked with Lydia down the corridor, away from the North Wing. "He has never called anyone that before," he said quietly. "Tia, Aunt, we have no family close enough for him to use such terms." "Would you prefer I correct him?" Lydia asked carefully. "No." Adrian stopped walking and turned to face her. "No. I think perhaps it is good that he has someone he feels close enough to give such a name. You have been more of a family to him in these past weeks than I have been in years." They had reached the main staircase, and Adrian hesitated, as if uncertain whether to continue walking with her or to part ways there. It was Lydia who made the decision. "Will you dine with me this evening, Your Grace, in the dining room, properly, rather than me taking my meals alone as usual?" Adrian's surprise was evident. Yes. Yes, that would be acceptable. It was a small thing, sharing a meal, but it marked the beginning of a new pattern. Where before Adrian had avoided her as if she carried some contagion, he now sought her company, at least in limited and carefully managed ways. They dined together in the evenings, and gradually the silences between courses grew less oppressive. He would ask about Thomas's progress, and she would tell him about the lessons she had been giving the boy in reading and simple mathematics. He would mention estate business, and she would offer thoughts, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence as she realized he was actually listening. One evening, over dessert, Adrian set down his spoon and looked at her with an expression of genuine curiosity. "Where did you learn about healing? The treatments you used for Thomas, the willow bark and mustard plasters. That is not knowledge typically possessed by a viscount's daughter." Lydia smiled, surprised by the question. "My grandmother on my mother's side was the daughter of an apothecary. She married above her station to a younger son of a baronet, and never quite lost the practical knowledge she had gained in her father's shop. When I was young, she would take me with her when she visited the tenants and cottagers on my father's estate. She believed that healing was a skill every woman should possess, regardless of rank." "Your father allowed this?" "My father barely noticed," Lydia said, more honestly than she had intended. "He was often away or occupied with other matters. My mother was content to let my grandmother have me, as long as I also learned the accomplishments expected of a young lady. So I had dancing lessons and pianoforte lessons, but I also learned which herbs would bring down a fever and how to set a broken finger." Adrian was quiet for a moment, considering. "I envy you that knowledge. I have been taught to manage an estate, to understand politics and finance, to conduct myself properly in society. But when my son was dying, I had no idea how to help him. I was utterly useless." "You were present," Lydia said gently. "That night, you stayed with him. You talked to him. That was not useless. Only because you forced me to see what I had been avoiding." He met her eyes across the table. "I have never thanked you properly for that, for making me be the father I should have been all along." The gratitude in his voice, the genuine warmth of it, made Lydia's throat tighten. "You are being that father now. That is what matters." 2 days later, a letter arrived from Whitmore House. Lydia recognized Catherine's handwriting on the envelope and felt a rush of homesickness so strong it made her dizzy. She took the letter to the library, where she could read it in private. Catherine's words spilled across the pages with the unrestrained enthusiasm of a 16-year-old with news to share. Mamma was feeling better, more herself than she had been since Papa's death. The cottage at Whitmore House was comfortable, and the pension was generous enough that they wanted for nothing. Catherine had been taking drawing lessons from a local artist and was becoming quite accomplished. She asked after Lydia's well-being with the careful casualness of someone trying not to seem worried, and ended by begging for a visit if Lydia could spare the time. Lydia read the letter 3 times, then sat at the library desk and composed her response. She told Catherine about Thomas, about his illness and recovery, about teaching him to read. She mentioned the library at Ashbourne Manor, which was extensive and well-maintained. She described the grounds, the orchard that would soon be in bloom, the conservatory that she hoped to restore. What she did not mention was the loneliness that still sometimes overwhelmed her in the early morning hours, or the strange, complicated relationship developing between herself and Adrian, which she did not fully understand and certainly could not explain to her 16-year-old sister. She sealed the letter and left it in the hall to be posted, feeling both better and worse for having written it. Better because Catherine and her mother were well. Worse because she missed them with an ache that never quite went away. It was later that week, over another dinner, that Lydia broached the subject that had been occupying her thoughts for days. "Thomas is much stronger now," she began carefully. "His colour is better, his appetite has improved, and he has not had so much as a sniffle in weeks." "Thanks to your care," Adrian replied. "Thanks to proper food and an open window," Lydia corrected. "But there is something else he needs, something I cannot provide within the walls of that room." Adrian's expression grew wary. "What are you suggesting? Fresh air, sunlight, exercise?" Lydia leaned forward slightly, willing him to understand. "He is 6 years old, and he has not been outside in 3 years. His body will never grow strong if we keep him locked away like a hothouse flower. He needs to move, to run if he is able, to feel the wind and the sun. He needs to live, not merely survive. The risk of illness is less than the risk of keeping him confined." Lydia interrupted gently. You said yourself that you wanted to be a better father to him. This is how you start. By letting him be a child. Adrian was silent for a long time, his fingers drumming against the table in a rhythm that spoke of internal conflict. Finally, he sighed. Supervised visits to the orchard only. Short ones at first. And if he shows any sign of fatigue or distress, he comes inside immediately. Lydia felt relief flood through her. Of course, we will be careful. We? Adrian raised an eyebrow. I assumed you would want to accompany him on his first outing. Another pause. Then Adrian nodded slowly. Yes, I would. The morning they chose was perfect. One of those rare April days when the sun shone warm, but not hot, and the breeze carried the scent of growing things. Thomas had been told the night before, and he had barely slept from excitement. When Lydia and Adrian arrived at his room just after breakfast, they found him already dressed and sitting on the edge of his bed, practically vibrating with anticipation. Is it time? May we go now? Adrian knelt down in front of his son, taking both small hands in his. We may go now. But Thomas, you must promise me that if you feel tired or unwell, you will tell us immediately. I promise, Papa. I promise. Thomas's eyes were shining. May I really go outside? Truly, truly. The walk from the north wing to the orchard was slow, Thomas still not quite steady on his legs after so long confined. Adrian carried him down the main stairs, and Lydia walked beside them, ready to assist if needed. Mrs. Hutchins followed at a discreet distance, carrying blankets in case they were needed. When they reached the door that led to the gardens, Adrian hesitated with his hand on the handle. Are you ready, Thomas? The boy nodded wordlessly, and Adrian opened the door. What happened next would remain etched in Lydia's memory for the rest of her life. Thomas stared out at the world beyond the threshold with an expression of such pure, overwhelming wonder that it was almost painful to witness. His mouth fell open, his eyes went wide, and then, slowly, tears began to stream down his face. Papa, he whispered. Papa, it is so beautiful. The orchard was indeed beautiful. The trees were just beginning to bud, tiny bursts of white and pink appearing on dark branches. The grass was green and thick, dotted with early wildflowers. The sky above was a blue so clear and bright it almost hurt to look at. For Thomas, who had seen these things only from a window for 3 years, it must have seemed like stepping into a different world entirely. Adrian carried his son down the path until they reached a spot where the sun fell warmly through the branches. There he set Thomas down gently, keeping one hand on his shoulder as if afraid he might disappear. Thomas took a few hesitant steps forward, then knelt in the grass. He pressed his hands flat against the earth, feeling the coolness of it, the texture. He looked up at the sky, squinting against the brightness. He laughed, a sound of such pure joy that it seemed to transform the very air around them. And Adrian, standing beside Lydia, smiled. It was a small smile, tentative and rusty from disuse, but it reached his eyes and softened the harsh lines of his face. It was the smile of a man who had forgotten what happiness felt like and was remembering, slowly and painfully, that it was still possible. Thank you, he said softly to Lydia. For this. It is not my doing, Lydia replied. It is yours. You chose to let him come here. They spent an hour in the orchard, Thomas exploring every tree trunk and flower, exclaiming over discoveries that would have seemed mundane to anyone else but were miracles to him. A beetle making its way across a leaf, a bird's nest visible in the branches above, the way the light filtered through new leaves. When they finally brought him back inside, he was exhausted but glowing with happiness. As Adrian tucked him into bed for a nap, Thomas caught his father's hand. Papa, may we do that again tomorrow? Yes, Thomas. We will do it again tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day that the weather allows. But while joy bloomed in the orchard and in Thomas's sick room, darker seeds were being sown elsewhere in Ashbourne Manor. Lady Philippa had watched the growing closeness between Adrian and his new wife with increasing alarm. She had seen them dining together, their heads bent in conversation. She had observed how Adrian now sought Lydia's opinion on matters he had previously discussed only with his aunt. And worst of all, she had witnessed that morning's excursion to the orchard, had seen the smile on her nephew's face, a smile she had not seen since Marguerite's death. Something had to be done. Lady Philippa began her campaign subtly, as all the best campaigns begin. A word here, dropped in the hearing of a superstitious housemaid. A question there, posed to a footman who had grown up with tales of witches and dark magic. She spoke of the unnatural way Thomas's fever had broken. She mentioned the strange herbs and potions Lydia had used. She wondered aloud, in carefully chosen company, whether it was truly medicine that had saved the boy, or something darker, something that required a price yet to be paid. The rumours spread through the servants' quarters like winter damp, seeping into corners and taking root. Lydia began to notice it in small ways. A kitchen maid who made a sign against evil when Lydia passed. A footman who dropped a vase when she entered a room unexpectedly, his face pale with fear. Whispers that stopped abruptly when she appeared. She mentioned it to Clara one evening, and the young maid's face grew troubled. "There is talk, Your Grace," Clara admitted reluctantly. "Foolish talk, but talk nonetheless. Some are saying you used witchcraft to cure Master Thomas, that you know things no Christian woman should know. Lady Philippa encourages it, though she pretends otherwise." Lydia felt cold settle in her stomach. She had faced many things since coming to Ashbourne Manor. Loneliness and cruelty and grief. But this was different. This was dangerous. In a world where women could still be accused of witchcraft, where fear and superstition held more power than reason, such rumours could destroy her. She climbed the stairs to her room that night, feeling the weight of hostile eyes following her through the shadows, and wondered how long it would be before the seeds Lady Philippa had planted bore their poisonous fruit. The end of May brought warmth to Ashbourne Manor, but with it came a chill of a different sort. Lydia had grown accustomed to the whispers that followed her through the corridors, the servants who made warding gestures when they thought she was not looking. She had told herself that superstition would fade once people saw that Thomas continued to thrive, that fear, born of ignorance, would eventually give way to acceptance. She had been wrong. She found the evidence of her miscalculation on a bright Thursday morning when she went to the orchard to gather some of the mint that grew wild near the stone wall. Thomas had complained of an upset stomach the evening before, and mint tea would settle it better than anything Dr. Pembley might prescribe. But when she reached the spot where the herbs grew thickest, she found only ashes. Someone had pulled up every plant by its roots and burned them in a pile. The earth was scorched black, and the smell of burned vegetation hung heavy in the air. Beside the ashes, weighted down with a stone, was a piece of paper. Lydia picked it up with trembling fingers. The word scrawled across it in rough letters was simple and damning. Witch. She stood there for a long moment, the paper crumpling in her grip, feeling anger and fear war within her chest. This was not random vandalism or the work of some superstitious tenant from the village. This had happened within the grounds of Ashbourne Manor, which meant someone in the household itself had done this. "Your Grace!" Lydia turned to find Clara approaching, her face pale with distress. "I tried to stop them," the maid said in a rush. "I heard them planning it last night, 2 of the footmen and 1 of the scullery maids. They said Lady Philippa had told them it needed to be done, that your herbs were unnatural and dangerous. I came as soon as I could this morning, but I was too late. Lady Philippa told them to do this?" Lydia's voice came out flat, drained of emotion. Clara nodded miserably. "She has been speaking to the servants for weeks now, Your Grace, asking questions about what you do, where you go, what you bring to Master Thomas's room. She calls it concern for the household, but—" The maid twisted her apron in her hands. "Your Grace, there are rumours, terrible rumours. Some are saying you used dark magic to cure Master Thomas, that you made a bargain with something unholy. They say the fever broke too quickly, too completely, that it was not natural. Now, and Lady Philippa encourages these rumours?" "She does not discourage them," Clara said carefully. "She asks questions that lead people to certain conclusions, and then she looks horrified when they reach those conclusions, as if she never intended such a thing. But Your Grace, she intends every word. I am certain of it." Lydia looked down at the ashes at her feet, at the destroyed plants that had been growing here long before she ever came to Ashbourne Manor. This was not just about superstition or ignorance. This was deliberate sabotage, a calculated effort to undermine her position in the household and perhaps drive her away entirely. "Thank you for telling me, Clara," Lydia said quietly. "You have been a true friend to me." That evening, dinner was a tense affair. Lady Philippa sat at the table in her usual place, looking serene and composed as she always did. Adrian discussed some matter involving the tenants in the North Quarter, seemingly oblivious to the undercurrents swirling through his household. And Lydia sat in silence, choosing her moment carefully. It came during the third course, when a lull in conversation left space for her words. "Lady Philippa," Lydia said, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet room. "I wonder if you might explain something to me." The older woman looked up from her plate, her expression one of polite inquiry. "Of course, my dear. What troubles you? This morning I went to gather herbs from the orchard and found them burned, destroyed, along with a rather unpleasant note. I am told that you instructed certain members of the household staff to do this." Lady Philippa's face registered perfect shock. "I? Why would I do such a thing? That is precisely what I am asking. My dear child, I think you have been misinformed. I would never instruct servants to destroy property, regardless of my personal feelings about the use of such rustic remedies." Adrian set down his fork, his attention now fully focused on the exchange. "What is this about?" Lydia kept her eyes on Lady Philippa. "It is about a campaign of rumour and intimidation that has been conducted against me for weeks. Whispers of witchcraft and dark magic. Servants making signs against evil when I pass. And now, the destruction of plants that I have been using to help your son, accompanied by an accusation written in plain terms." "How distressing," Lady Philippa murmured. "But surely you cannot believe that I would have anything to do with such base superstition." "I believe you have cultivated it," Lydia replied, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "You have asked leading questions and made observations calculated to raise fears. You have never directly accused me of anything, but you have made certain that others would." "This is preposterous," Lady Philippa said, turning to Adrian. "Adrian, surely you do not believe these accusations." But Adrian was watching his aunt with a new wariness in his eyes. "I believe I should speak with the staff about what has been happening. If rumours are being spread within this household, I need to understand their source." "By all means, investigate," Lady Philippa said smoothly. "I am confident that you will find I have done nothing improper. I have only ever tried to protect this family." The next 2 days were tense as Adrian quietly questioned servants. He spoke to footmen and maids, to the cook and the stable hands, to anyone who might have information about the rumours circulating through Ashbourne Manor. What he discovered confirmed Lydia's suspicions in damning detail. Lady Philippa had been careful, never issuing direct orders or making explicit accusations, but she had planted seeds with surgical precision. A comment here about how peculiar it was that Thomas's fever had broken so suddenly. A question there about whether Lydia's grandmother had been known for unusual practices. A worried observation that certain herbs were known to be used in old pagan rituals. Each comment harmless on its own, but together they had created a narrative of suspicion and fear. On the third evening, Adrian confronted his aunt in the drawing room. Lydia was not present for the conversation, but she heard about it later from Mrs. Hutchins, who had been passing by and overheard raised voices through the door. "Why?" Adrian had demanded. "Why would you do this to her?" "Because she does not belong here," Lady Philippa had replied, her composure finally cracking. "She is not Marguerite. She will never be Marguerite. That woman died bringing your son into this world, and you dishonour her memory by allowing this nobody from a bankrupt family to take her place. Lydia is not taking anyone's place. She is my wife. She is Thomas's. She is important to him. And she saved his life when I was too blind to see what he needed. She has bewitched you," Lady Philippa had hissed. "Just as she bewitched the boy. Marguerite would never have used such unnatural methods. She trusted proper medicine, proper physicians." "Marguerite is dead," Adrian had said, his voice going cold. "And Thomas is alive because of Lydia." Those are the facts, Aunt, regardless of how they make you feel. There had been more accusations and recriminations flying back and forth, but it had ended with an ultimatum. Lady Philippa could accept Lydia as the rightful Duchess of Ashbourne and treat her with the respect that position demanded, or she could retire to the dower property in the countryside that had been settled on her when her own husband died. Lady Philippa had chosen to leave. She departed 3 days later. Her belongings loaded into a carriage, her face set in lines of bitter resentment. She did not say goodbye to Lydia. She barely acknowledged her presence as she swept past to the waiting vehicle. But as she climbed in, she looked back at Ashbourne Manor with an expression that spoke volumes about what she was leaving behind. She loved this house, Adrian said quietly, standing beside Lydia on the front steps as they watched the carriage roll away. She lived here for 30 years, first as my uncle's wife, then as my father's hostess after my mother died, and finally as my advisor. She oversaw Thomas's birth. She was there when Marguerite died. This has been her home. I am sorry, Lydia said, meaning it. I know she was important to you. She was, Adrian agreed. But she was also wrong. About you. About what you have done for Thomas. About what you have done for me. He turned to look at her, his green eyes searching her face. I have been thinking a great deal these past days about loyalty and about the past, about what it means to honour those we have lost without being imprisoned by their memory. What have you concluded? That Marguerite would not have wanted me to live as I have been living. She was kind and generous and believed in moving forward, not dwelling in sorrow. I think she would have liked you, actually. I think she would have been grateful that you cared for Thomas when I could not. The admission clearly cost him something, and Lydia felt her throat tighten with emotion. Thank you for saying that. It is the truth. He paused, then added, I realize I have never properly asked you about your own life before you came here, about your family, your hopes, what you had to give up to marry me. And so, walking slowly through the gardens that afternoon, while Thomas napped and the servants adjusted to the absence of Lady Philippa's iron rule, Lydia told him. She spoke of Catherine's dreams of becoming an artist, of her mother's grief that had slowly transformed into a kind of gentle acceptance. She told him about the terror of watching her father gamble away their security, the shame of avoiding neighbours who knew their situation, the relief mixed with sorrow when he finally died, and at least the uncertainty ended. I was angry with him for a long time, Lydia admitted. Angry that he cared more about cards than about his family's future. But I have come to understand that his weakness did not mean he did not love us. He simply could not control himself. And you were left to pay the price of his weakness, Adrian said. We all pay prices for others' weakness. You paid for your father's absence during Marguerite's labour. Thomas paid for your fear after her death. These are the bargains life makes without consulting us. They talked for hours that day, and then again over dinner that evening, and in the days that followed. With Lady Philippa gone, a kind of ease settled over Ashbourne Manor. The servants, deprived of their source of fearful gossip, gradually returned to treating Lydia with proper respect. The rumours faded as Thomas continued to thrive, running through the orchard now with increasing confidence, his laughter ringing through the grounds like bells. Adrian spoke more freely about Marguerite, and Lydia learned that while he had loved his first wife, it had been a quiet, respectful love built on duty and companionship, rather than passion. I was 28 when we married, Adrian told her one evening, as they sat in the library, books open but largely ignored. She was 23. Both our families thought it an excellent match, and it was in many ways. We were compatible. We rarely argued. She managed the household beautifully, and I managed the estates, and we coexisted peacefully. But, Lydia prompted gently, but I did not know her, not really. We never had conversations like this, where we talked about fears and regrets and the things that shaped us. We were cordial and kind to each other, but there was always a distance between us. When she died, I felt terrible guilt, but I also felt, he hesitated, I felt guilty for not feeling more grief, for not being as devastated as I thought I should be. Grief is not measured by volume, Lydia said quietly. You lost your wife and nearly lost your son. That would break anyone, regardless of the depth of romantic feeling. She deserved better than I gave her. She deserved a husband who could have been truly present with her, emotionally as well as physically. And now she is gone, and I can never make that right. No, Lydia agreed. But you can honour her by being that father to Thomas, by being present for him as you could not be for her. That is its own form of making amends. It was late one evening, perhaps a week after Lady Philippa's departure, when the moment happened that would change everything. They were in the library again, as had become their habit, sitting near the fire as the spring evening cooled. Adrian was looking through an old journal, something from his school days, and laughing at his younger self's pretensions. "Listen to this," he said, holding the journal toward her. "I was 17 and had just read Byron for the first time. I thought I was terribly deep and philosophical." Lydia leaned closer to see the page, and as she did, her hand brushed against his where he held the book. It was the lightest contact, barely worth noticing, but they both froze. The air in the library suddenly felt charged with something neither of them could name. Lydia was acutely aware of how close they were sitting, close enough that she could smell the faint scent of soap and wool that clung to Adrian's clothes. Close enough that when he turned his head to look at her, his face was mere inches from hers. For a moment, neither of them moved. Adrian's eyes searched hers, and she saw in them confusion and want and fear, all tangled together. Her heart hammered so hard she was certain he must hear it. Then Adrian pulled back, setting the journal aside with hands that trembled slightly. "It is late," he said, his voice rough. "You should retire." "Yes," Lydia agreed, though she made no move to stand. "Yes, I suppose I should." But she sat there for another moment, feeling the weight of everything unspoken between them, feeling the pull of something that might, with time and courage, become more than friendship, and feeling the terror of wanting something she had convinced herself was impossible. When she finally went up to her room, she lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and feeling her carefully guarded heart beginning to crack open, despite all her efforts to keep it safely closed. June arrived at Ashbourne Manor with the full glory of summer, and with it came a transformation that seemed almost miraculous to those who had known the estate in its years of mourning. The orchard, which had been left to grow wild after Marguerite's death, bloomed with such profusion that the air hung heavy with the scent of apple and pear blossoms. The gardens, tended now by staff who were no longer afraid to disturb the shrine to the late Duchess's memory, burst into riots of colour, and through it all ran Thomas, his laughter echoing off stone walls that had been silent for far too long. The boy was nearly unrecognisable from the pale, withdrawn child Lydia had first discovered in that locked room. His cheeks held colour now, a healthy flush that came from hours spent outdoors. His legs, once so thin they could barely support his weight, had grown stronger from climbing trees and racing across the lawns. He still tired more easily than other children his age might, and occasionally a cough would remind them all of his fragile beginnings. But these episodes grew rarer with each passing week. Lydia watched Thomas's transformation with a joy that sometimes felt almost painful in its intensity. This was what she had fought for during those early, desperate weeks. This laughing, running, thoroughly alive child was the reason she had defied Dr. Pemberley and risked Adrian's wrath and stayed up through that endless night, willing the fever to break. Seeing him thrive made every lonely evening in her attic room, every cutting remark from Lady Philippa, every moment of uncertainty worth enduring. But watching Thomas was not the only thing that occupied Lydia's thoughts as summer deepened. She found herself increasingly aware of Adrian, of the way his whole bearing had changed in the months since his son's illness. The rigid tension that had characterized his movements was gone, replaced by something more fluid, more present. He smiled now, easily and often, especially when Thomas was near. And sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, Lydia would catch him looking at her with an expression she could not quite decipher, but that made her heart beat faster nonetheless. She tried not to hope. Hope was dangerous for a woman in her position, a woman who had been acquired like a piece of furniture to serve a specific purpose. Adrian had been kind to her, had shown her respect and gratitude, had even shared confidences about his late wife that suggested a growing trust. But trust was not love, and she would be a fool to mistake his appreciation for something deeper. Still, there were moments when she wondered. Moments when their hands would brush as they both reached for the same book, and Adrian would pull back as if burned, his eyes darkening with something that looked very much like longing. Moments when she would catch him watching her read to Thomas, his expression soft with an emotion she dared not name. Moments when the air between them seemed to thicken with possibilities neither of them had the courage to voice. It was on one of those perfect June afternoons, with sunlight dappling through the orchard leaves and bees humming drowsily among the flowers, that everything shifted. Thomas had been playing with a wooden sword Adrian had commissioned from the village carpenter, fighting imaginary dragons with the fierce concentration of a child who had spent too many years with nothing but imagination for entertainment. Lydia and Adrian sat on a bench nearby, ostensibly reading but actually watching Thomas more than their books, both reluctant to miss a single moment of this hard-won normalcy. "Watch this, Papa," Thomas called, preparing to execute some elaborate maneuver he had clearly been practicing. "Watch me slay the dragon!" He ran forward, sword held high, his attention so focused on the imaginary beast before him that he failed to notice the exposed tree root in his path. His foot caught, and he went down hard, his cry of surprise cut short by a sharp gasp of pain. Lydia was on her feet instantly, but Adrian was faster. He had Thomas in his arms before Lydia took 3 steps, his face pale with the old fear that had once ruled his every decision regarding his son. "Where does it hurt?" Adrian's voice was tight. "Thomas, where?" "My ankle, Papa." "I twisted it." Thomas's face was screwed up against tears, trying to be brave, but his lower lip trembled. Lydia knelt beside them, gently taking Thomas's foot in her hands. The ankle was already beginning to swell, but when she carefully rotated it, feeling for breaks or serious damage, Thomas hissed but did not cry out. "It is a sprain," she said, looking up at Adrian. "Painful, but not serious. We need cold compresses, and he should stay off it for a few days." She waited for Adrian to panic, to insist they send for Dr. Pembley immediately, to declare that Thomas must be confined to bed for weeks. But instead, after a moment of visible internal struggle, Adrian simply nodded. "Can you treat it?" "Yes, I will need cloth soaked in cold water from the well, and he should elevate the foot. But Adrian, he will be fine. Children twist their ankles. It is part of being active and alive." Something in her words seemed to reach him. The fear in his eyes receded, replaced by a kind of wondering recognition. "Yes," he said quietly. "Yes, I suppose it is." They carried Thomas inside, where Lydia wrapped his ankle in cloths soaked in well water so cold it made the boy gasp. She elevated his foot on pillows and gave him willow bark tea for the pain and swelling. Within an hour, Thomas was already feeling well enough to complain about being stuck in bed when there were dragons left to slay in the orchard. "The dragons will wait," Adrian told him, ruffling his son's hair with a casualness that still seemed new, still seemed like something he was learning how to do. "They are not going anywhere." That night, after Thomas had fallen asleep and the house had settled into its evening quiet, Lydia found Adrian in the library. He was standing by the window, looking out over the darkening grounds, and he did not turn when she entered. "He is already walking on it," Adrian said without preamble. "Mrs. Hutchins said he got up to use the chamber pot and barely limped at all." "Children heal quickly," Lydia replied, coming to stand beside him. "Especially healthy, active children who are not locked away from life." "I did not panic today," Adrian said, and there was wonder in his voice. "When he fell, my first instinct was still fear, that terrible, paralyzing fear that I have lived with for so long. But then I looked at you, and you were calm, and I thought perhaps I could be calm too. Perhaps I could trust that not every injury is a death sentence. Perhaps I could finally let go of the fear. That is good, Adrian. That is progress." He turned to look at her then, his green eyes searching her face in the fading light. "You have given me that. You have given me back my son, and you have given me back the possibility of hope. I do not know how to thank you for that. You do not need to thank me. I did what anyone would have done." "No," he said firmly. You did what I should have done years ago, but was too afraid to attempt. You saw a child who needed help, and you helped him, despite every obstacle I placed in your way. You are remarkable, Lydia. I am only beginning to understand how remarkable. The intensity in his voice, the warmth of it, made Lydia's breath catch. For a moment, she allowed herself to hope that perhaps he was feeling what she felt, that perhaps the growing connection between them was mutual. But then, as if sensing her thoughts, Adrian stepped back, putting distance between them once more. They fell into an uneasy silence, and Lydia returned to her room with her heart feeling heavy, despite the progress they had made. A week later, on a morning brilliant with sunshine, Thomas asked the question that would shatter the fragile peace they had built. They were in the orchard again, Thomas's ankle fully healed and forgotten. Lydia was showing him how to identify different types of birds by their songs, a skill her grandmother had taught her. Adrian sat nearby, supposedly reviewing estate correspondence, but actually listening to his wife teach his son with a skill and patience that made something ache in his chest. "Tia Lydia," Thomas said suddenly, interrupting a lesson about wrens and thrushes. "You will stay with us always, will you not? You will not leave like Mamma did?" Lydia felt her heart clench at the innocent question. "I am the Duchess, Thomas. This is my home now. But that is not what I asked." Thomas's green eyes, so like his father's, regarded her with a seriousness beyond his years. "I mean, will you always be here? Will you always take care of me and tell me stories and teach me things? Will you be like a mama to me?" The silence that followed was deafening. Lydia looked at Adrian, hoping he would answer, hoping he would offer some reassurance that she was indeed a permanent fixture in Thomas's life. But Adrian's face had gone carefully blank, the way it used to go in those early days when he wanted to hide what he was feeling. "Your Tia Lydia is the Duchess," Adrian said after a long pause, his voice neutral. "She will continue to fulfill her duties as such." It was not an answer, not really. It was an evasion, careful and deliberate. Thomas, sensing the adult's discomfort, but not understanding it, let the subject drop. But Lydia felt as if she had been struck. She excused herself shortly after, claiming a headache, and walked through the gardens alone, trying to understand why Adrian's non-answer had hurt so deeply. She had known from the beginning what her role was. She had accepted the terms of their arrangement with open eyes. So why did it feel like a betrayal now to be reminded that she was here to fulfill duties, not to be loved? "Because you have been foolish enough to fall in love with him," she told herself bitterly. "Because you let hope grow where you knew it had no soil to root in." That evening, she found Adrian in his study and closed the door behind her with more force than necessary. "We need to talk," she said without preamble. Adrian looked up from his desk, surprise flickering across his face. "Is something wrong?" "That depends on your perspective." Lydia moved further into the room, her hands clasped tightly to stop them from trembling. "This morning, your son asked me if I would stay with him always, if I would be like a mother to him. And you could not even give him the courtesy of a straight answer." "Lydia, no, let me finish. I have been here for 5 months now. 5 months during which I have cared for your son, managed your household, and tried to be useful in whatever way you would allow. I have watched Thomas flourish, and I have watched you become the father he deserves. I have been grateful to play some small part in that transformation. But I need to know, Adrian, what am I to you? Am I truly just an employee with a title, a useful convenience who happens to share your name, or is there any possibility, any hope at all, that I might eventually be more?" The words hung between them, raw and honest. Adrian had gone very still, his face a study in conflicting emotions. "I do not know what you want me to say," he finally managed. "The truth," Lydia replied. "I want you to tell me the truth, even if it is painful to hear." Adrian stood, moving around the desk to face her directly. "The truth is complicated, then uncomplicate it." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration she had come to recognize. "The truth is that I am afraid. I am afraid that if I allow myself to feel for you what I am beginning to feel, I will be betraying Marguerite's memory. She died because of me, Lydia. because I was not there when she needed me most. And now here you are, alive and vibrant and making me want things I thought I had buried with her. How can I let myself love you when loving her cost her everything? The admission stole Lydia's breath. He had said love. Not in the present tense, not as a declaration, but he had said it nonetheless. Marguerite's death was not your fault, Lydia said gently. And loving again is not a betrayal of her memory. It is simply living, Adrian. It is allowing yourself to be human. I do not know if I remember how to do that, Adrian said, his voice breaking slightly. I have spent so long being afraid, so long trying to protect what little I had left, that I have forgotten how to simply be. Lydia wanted to go to him, to offer comfort, but she held herself back. Then learn, she said quietly. Learn how to live again. Learn how to let people in, and learn to see me not as Marguerite's replacement or as a duty to be fulfilled, but as myself, as someone who cares for Thomas, yes, but also as someone who has come to care very much for you. She left before he could respond, before he could see the tears that were threatening to fall. She had said too much, revealed too much, but she could not regret it. Better to know where she stood, even if that knowledge hurt, than to continue in this limbo of uncertainty. That night, lying in her bed and staring at the ceiling, Lydia made herself face the possibility that Adrian might never be able to give her what she wanted, that he might forever be trapped in his guilt and his fear, unable to move forward. And if that was the case, she would have to decide whether she could continue to live in this house, loving a man who could not love her back, or whether she would need to find the courage to leave, even if leaving meant giving up Thomas and the life she had begun to build here. It was a choice she hoped she would not have to make, but as sleep finally claimed her in the early hours of morning, she knew that the time for choices was coming, whether she was ready for it or not. Adrian did not sleep that night. He sat in his study long after Lydia left, staring at nothing, replaying her words over and over in his mind. She had asked him to see her as herself, not as Marguerite's replacement, not as a duty to be fulfilled. She had admitted to caring for him, and he had stood there like a coward, unable to give her the answer she deserved. Near midnight, he rose from his chair and walked through the silent house. His feet carried him not to his bedroom, not to Thomas's room to check on his sleeping son, but out through the garden doors and across the grounds to the small family cemetery, where generations of Graymonts lay beneath marble and stone. Marguerite's headstone was white marble, carved with roses, and the simple inscription, "Beloved wife and mother." Adrian had chosen it himself, though he had not returned to this spot since the day they lowered her coffin into the ground 6 years ago. He had told himself it was too painful, but the truth was something different. The truth was that he had been too angry at himself and at her and at the entire cruel universe that had taken her from him. He knelt in the damp grass, heedless of the moisture seeping through his trousers, and for the first time in 6 years, he spoke to his dead wife. "I am sorry," he said into the darkness. "I am sorry I was not there when you needed me. I am sorry I chose business over you, that I thought I had time when I did not. I am sorry that Thomas grew up without his mother, because I was not where I should have been." The night offered no answer, only the rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. "But I need to tell you something else," Adrian continued, his voice growing steadier. "I need to tell you that I am tired of punishing myself. I am tired of living half a life, of being afraid to feel anything because feeling means risking loss. You would not have wanted that for me. You were always so practical, so determined that we should all make the best of what we had. And I have not been making the best of anything. I have been surviving, barely, when I should have been living." He placed his palm flat against the cold marble. "There is a woman in the house now. You would have liked her, I think. She is nothing like you. And yet in some ways, you are very similar. She is brave where you were kind. She is direct where you were gentle. But she has the same core of strength, the same determination to do what is right, even when it is difficult. She saved Thomas. She saved me, though I did not realize I needed saving." Tears were running down his face now, hot against the cool night air. I think I am falling in love with her, Marguerite. I did not mean to. I tried very hard not to. But she has gotten under my defences, into the places I thought I had sealed off forever. And I am terrified because loving her feels like letting you go. And I do not know if I am ready to do that. He waited, half expecting some sign, some indication of approval or condemnation. But there was nothing. Just the peaceful silence of the dead who had moved beyond such earthly concerns. I am going to let you go now, Adrian said quietly. Not forget you. Never that. But let go of this guilt that has been eating me alive. Let go of the fear that has made me a prisoner in my own life. You gave me Thomas, and that was the greatest gift I could have received. But you would want me to give him a full life, a happy childhood. And I cannot do that while I am still clinging to the past. He rose, his knees protesting the cold and damp, and looked down at the headstone one last time. Thank you for the time we had. Rest well, Marguerite. I will honour your memory by living the way you would have wanted me to live, by being the father and the man I should have been all along. As he walked back toward the house, Adrian felt lighter than he had in years. The guilt was still there, would probably always be there in some measure, but it no longer controlled him. He had given himself permission to move forward, and with that permission came a clarity of purpose that made his next steps obvious. He found Lydia in the orchard at dawn, sitting on the stone bench where they had watched Thomas play so many times before. She was dressed simply, her blonde hair loose around her shoulders, and she was watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, and he saw wariness in her blue eyes, as if she were bracing herself for more disappointment. I went to Marguerite's grave last night, Adrian said, coming to stand before her. I spoke to her for the first time since she died. I told her about you. Lydia's expression softened slightly. What did you tell her? That I was sorry for failing her, that I was tired of living in the past, and that I was falling in love with someone new, someone extraordinary, and that I was afraid of what that meant. Lydia's breath caught. Adrian, let me finish, please. He sat beside her on the bench, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Last night, after you left, I realized something. I have spent 6 years believing that loving again would be a betrayal of Marguerite. But I had it wrong. The betrayal would be refusing to live, refusing to let anyone care for me or to care for anyone in return. Marguerite deserved a husband who was present and engaged, and I failed to give her that. But I can honour her memory by being that man now, by being present for Thomas and for you. He took Lydia's hand, feeling the slight roughness of her palms, the capable strength of her fingers. You asked me what you are to me. The truth is, you are everything I did not know I needed. You are strength without harshness, compassion without weakness. You are the voice of reason when fear overwhelms me. You are the light that came into this house and drove out 6 years of darkness. And somewhere along the way, while I was busy being afraid and guilty and foolish, I fell in love with you. Tears were streaming down Lydia's face now. You do not have to say these things just because I asked for honesty. I can accept that you may never. I am not saying them out of obligation, Adrian interrupted gently. I am saying them because they are true. I love you, Lydia. Not as I loved Marguerite, which was quiet and comfortable and based on duty. I love you with something fiercer, something that terrifies me because it feels so much more vital. I love the way you argue with me when you think I am wrong. I love your laugh and your stubbornness and the way you read to Thomas with different voices for all the characters. I love that you were brave enough to break into a locked room to help a lonely child, and brave enough to stand up to me when I was being a fool. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. I am not asking you to forget the circumstances that brought you here. I know our marriage began as a transaction, a business arrangement. But I am asking if you would be willing to begin again, to let me court you properly this time, to build something real between us. Lydia was crying in earnest now, but she was also smiling. You are an idiot, she said through her tears. A complete and utter idiot. Adrian felt his heart sink. I understand if you cannot forgive. Ah, no, you do not understand anything, Lydia interrupted. I called you an idiot because I have been in love with you for months now, and it has been torture watching you be kind and considerate and thinking it was only gratitude. I thought I was going mad, wanting something I could never have. You love me." Adrian's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Yes, you fool. I love you. I love your dedication to Thomas, and the way you smile when you think no one is watching. I love how hard you try to be better than you were yesterday. I love your honesty about your failings and your determination to overcome them. I have tried so hard not to love you because I thought it would only lead to heartbreak. But I failed spectacularly at that particular endeavour." Adrian felt something break loose in his chest, something that had been wound tight for so long he had forgotten it was there. Joy, he realised. This was what joy felt like. "May I kiss you?" he asked. "As your husband, not out of duty, but because I love you and cannot bear to wait another moment." "Yes," Lydia breathed. "Please, yes." The kiss was tentative at first, as if they were both afraid of breaking the spell. But then Lydia's arms came up around his neck, and Adrian pulled her closer, and the kiss deepened into something that promised everything they had both thought lost. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, the sun had fully risen, and the orchard was alive with birdsong. "We should tell Thomas," Lydia said, her voice soft and wondering. "We should," Adrian agreed, "though I suspect he already knows. He has been asking when I'm going to marry you properly for weeks now." Lydia laughed, the sound bright and free. "Has he indeed? He is remarkably perceptive for a 6-year-old. He sees more than we give him credit for." They sat together on the bench for a long while, hands entwined, watching the morning light strengthen and feeling the future unfold before them like a path through a garden. There would be challenges ahead, Adrian knew. There would be moments of doubt and fear, but for the first time in 6 years, he felt ready to face them, because he would not be facing them alone. The months that followed were a revelation. Adrian courted his wife the way he should have done from the beginning, with flowers and compliments and quiet evenings where they talked about everything and nothing. They took walks through the grounds, taught Thomas to fish in the stream, restored the conservatory together. The house that had been silent for so long filled with life and laughter. Thomas flourished under their combined attention, growing stronger and more confident every day. He made friends with the children of tenants, learned to ride the pony Adrian bought him, and began lessons with a tutor who was amazed at how quick and eager the boy was to learn. Lydia established her herbal clinic for the tenants, with Dr. Pembley's grudging approval and eventual respect. The two of them developed an unlikely partnership, his traditional medicine combining with her practical knowledge to provide better care than either could have offered alone. And through it all, Adrian fell more deeply in love with his wife, discovering new depths to her character every day. The way she hummed while she worked, the way she argued passionately about books, the way she looked at him across the dinner table as if he were the only person in the world. Christmas of 1813 arrived with snow and celebration. The first true Christmas Ashbourne Manor had seen in years. The house was transformed. Garlands of evergreen and holly draped every banister. Candles flickered in every window. The smell of roasted goose and mince pies filled the air. And in the drawing room, a tree, a tradition Adrian had learned about from German friends, stood decorated with paper ornaments that Thomas had made himself. Lydia, now 7 months pregnant with their first child together, sat in a comfortable chair by the fire, her hand resting on her swollen belly. She was radiant in a dress of deep blue velvet, her blonde hair pinned up in a style that Catherine had helped her arrange that morning. Catherine, now 18 and looking remarkably like her sister, sat nearby, sketching the scene with the confident strokes of someone who had found her calling. She had been living at Ashbourne Manor for the past 6 months, ostensibly as a companion to Lydia, but really because Adrian had insisted that family should be together. Lady Sutton, grey-haired but smiling, in a way she had not smiled in years, occupied the other comfortable chair. She had been hesitant to accept Adrian's invitation to live in the cottage on the estate grounds, but her daughters had insisted, and she had discovered that security and peace did wonders for one's disposition. Clara moved quietly among the guests with a tray of spiced cider, no longer the frightened maid who once whispered about locked doors in dark corridors, but a young woman whose quiet loyalty had earned her Mrs. Hutchins's open praise. Mrs. Hutchins oversaw the festivities with the calm authority of someone who had survived both grief and gossip, her sharp eye softening whenever it fell on Thomas and the Duchess. Thomas, now a robust 8-year-old who showed no sign of his early fragility, was directing the hanging of the last ornaments on the tree with the authority of a general marshalling troops. He had grown tall for his age, his face had filled out, and his eyes sparkled with the joy of a child who finally understood what it meant to be loved without condition. Dr. Pembley arrived late in the afternoon, stamping snow from his boots and carrying a medical bag despite it being a social call. He had become a regular visitor, drawn by the clinic's success, and if Adrian was not mistaken, by a certain widow who lived in the village and occasionally helped Lydia with her herbal preparations. "Your Grace," Dr. Pembley said, bowing to Lydia. "You look well. The child is positioned correctly?" "Perfectly according to the midwife," Lydia assured him. "And I feel wonderful, despite this one's fondness for kicking my ribs." "A boy, then," Dr. Pembley pronounced. "They are always more troublesome before they are born. Or a very determined girl," Lydia countered with a smile. Adrian stood by the window, watching his family gather around the tree, and felt his chest tighten with emotion. "This," he thought, "this is what I nearly lost. This warmth, this joy, this life." Thomas ran over to him, tugging on his sleeve. "Papa, will the baby be a brother or a sister?" "We will find out in 2 months," Adrian replied, ruffling his son's hair. "Which would you prefer?" "Either," Thomas said seriously. "As long as they are healthy and I can teach them things. Tia Lydia says I will be an excellent teacher. I am certain you will be." Lydia caught Adrian's eye across the room and smiled. The smile that never failed to make his heart turn over. He crossed to her, took her hand, and kissed it gently. "Are you happy?" he asked quietly. "Deliriously," she replied, "though I might be happier if this child would stop using my bladder as a footstool." Adrian laughed and placed his hand on her belly, feeling the strong kick of new life within. "Not long now." "No," Lydia agreed. "Not long at all." As evening fell, and candles were lit throughout the house, as carols were sung and gifts exchanged, as Thomas fell asleep on the sofa, with a new book clutched to his chest, and Catherine sketched by firelight, while Lady Sutton told stories of Christmases past, Adrian pulled Lydia close and held her. This woman who had saved him without even trying. "Thank you," he whispered into her hair. "For what?" "For being stubborn enough to break down my walls. For loving Thomas when I could not show him how. For teaching me that it is possible to honor the past while embracing the future. For giving me a life I did not know I could have." Lydia tilted her face up to his. "You gave me the same, you know. When I came here, I thought I was trading my freedom for security. I did not realize I was actually finding my home." They kissed gently, sweetly, while around them their family continued their celebrations, oblivious to the quiet moment of connection between the Duke and his Duchess. Outside, snow continued to fall on Ashbourne Manor, blanketing the orchard where Thomas had first run free, covering the gardens that Lydia had restored, settling on the cemetery where Marguerite rested in peace, finally released from the burden of guilt that had kept her memory captive. Inside, firelight and candlelight and laughter created a warmth that went deeper than any physical heat could reach. And in the library, unnoticed by anyone, a portrait had been hung earlier that day. It showed a family, a tall man with dark hair and green eyes, a blonde woman with a serene smile, and between them, a boy with light brown hair and his father's eyes. They were standing in an orchard in full bloom, and they were smiling. Beneath the portrait, a small brass plate bore an inscription: "The Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne, with their son Thomas. Spring, 1813. It was not a replacement for the portraits of Marguerite that still hung throughout the house. It was simply an addition, a recognition that families grow and change, that love does not diminish by being shared, and that sometimes the greatest happiness comes from the most unexpected sources. Dear listener, we have reached the end of our journey through the halls of Ashbourne Manor. What began with a woman sleeping in an attic and a man locked in his grief has ended with a family built not on obligation, but on choice. Not on duty, but on love. Sometimes the coldest winters yield the warmest springs. Sometimes the walls we build to protect ourselves are the very things we need to tear down. And sometimes, just sometimes, arranged marriages become the greatest love stories of all. May your own life be filled with such unexpected joy. May you have the courage to love even when it terrifies you. May you build walls when necessary, but know when to let them fall. And may you always remember that it is never too late to begin again. Thank you for listening. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and a comment below. Subscribe to this channel for more tales of love found in unlikely places. And until next time, sleep well, dream beautifully, and remember that every ending is simply another beginning waiting to unfold. Good night.